The boy wasn't disabled, but the cook discovered the reason for the silence. Margaret Johnson adjusted her white apron one last time before ringing the bell of the imposing mansion in Beverly Hills. At 52 years old, she had worked in dozens of family homes, but she never imagined she would encounter a situation as disturbing as the one she was about to discover. The man who opened the door wore an impeccable suit and had a cold expression on his face that didn't match the supposed joy of welcoming a new employee. Richard Thompson, a real estate businessman, explained curtly that his son Michael had serious problems and that she shouldn't worry too much about the boy. "He doesn't speak," said Richard, leading Margaret through the luxurious house. "The doctors say it's a neurological condition. You just need to prepare his meals and leave them in his room. Don't try to talk to him. It's a waste of time." Margaret felt a tightness in her chest. In all her years of experience, she had never met a child who was treated with such coldness by his own father. As she walked through the hallways decorated with expensive furniture and works of art, she noticed something strange. There wasn't a single family photo in sight. "Where is Mrs. Thompson?" asked Margaret, curious about the absence of the boy's mother. "She doesn't live here anymore," Richard answered sharply. "Michael is better off with just me, less confusion for his head." The kitchen was a dream for any professional in the field. Marble countertops, an industrial stove, a double refrigerator, and every utensil imaginable. But what caught Margaret's attention the most was a small notebook forgotten on the counter, filled with colorful drawings that seemed to be recipes. "Whose is this?" she asked, flipping through the pages. Richard snatched the notebook from her hands with brutality. "Michael scribbles these silly things when he comes down here. Ignore it. He has a fixation on food, but he doesn't understand anything he draws." Margaret immediately doubted that explanation. The drawings were too detailed to be just scribbles from a child with neurological problems. There were specific ingredients, preparation techniques, and even notes in well-formed letters. On her first day of work, Margaret prepared a simple lunch: rice, beans, grilled chicken, and sautéed vegetables. Richard had left instructions for her to leave the tray in front of the boys' room, knock on the door and walk away. But Margaret's maternal curiosity spoke louder. She knocked on the door and waited. After a few seconds, the door opened, revealing a blond boy with wavy hair and the most expressive blue eyes she had ever seen. Michael couldn't have been more than 8 years old. He was thin and pale, but his eyes shone with a sharp intelligence that completely contrasted with the description his father had given. "Hi, my angel," said Margaret, kneeling to be at the boy's eye level. "I'm Margaret, your new cook. I brought your lunch." Michael didn't respond, but his eyes fixed on hers with surprising intensity. He took the tray, nodded slightly as if to say thank you, and closed the door gently. Margaret stood in the hallway for a few minutes processing what she had seen. That boy definitely did not have neurological problems. His movements were coordinated, his posture was upright, and most importantly, there was total understanding in his eyes. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The next afternoon, while washing the dishes, Margaret heard footsteps coming down the stairs. It was Michael, wearing a brown t-shirt and jeans, walking silently toward the kitchen. She pretended to be busy, but watched the boy's every movement through the window's reflection. Michael approached the counter where Margaret had left some ingredients for dinner: tomatoes, onions, garlic, and basil. The boy took a sheet of paper and began to draw something with precise and quick movements. When he finished, he left the paper on the counter and left the kitchen without making a sound. Margaret rushed to see the drawing and was speechless. It was a complete tomato sauce recipe, with exact quantities of each ingredient and even the cooking time specified. "This is impossible," she murmured to herself. "How can a child with neurological problems know such an elaborate recipe?" Margaret decided to test the boy. The next day, she deliberately left some different ingredients on the counter: eggs, milk, flour, and sugar. Once again, Michael appeared in the kitchen and drew a perfect pancake recipe, including tips on how to get the batter just right. With each passing day, Margaret became more convinced that there was something very wrong with the story Richard had told. Michael not only understood everything around him perfectly, but also demonstrated impressive culinary knowledge for a child his age. It was on a Thursday that Margaret decided to investigate more deeply. Richard had left for a business meeting and would be away all day. She took the opportunity to talk to Mrs. Henderson, the elderly neighbor who lived next door. "Mrs. Henderson, do you know the Thompson family well?" asked Margaret over the fence that separated the gardens. The woman with grey hair and reading glasses looked around cautiously before answering. "I do, my dear. A very strange family, if you want my opinion," whispered Mrs. Henderson. "That boy was a normal child until about 3 years ago. He talked, played, sang, just like any other." "He sang?" Margaret was interested in the information. "Oh, how he sang, an angel's voice, I swear." Voice. His poor mother, Jennifer, was always so proud, saying her son would be a great singer one day, but after she left, the boy never opened his mouth again. The mother left? Mr. Richard said she didn't live here anymore, but he didn't explain why. Mrs. Henderson sighed deeply and looked around once more. "It was a very ugly separation, my dear. Lots of shouting, lawyers coming and going, court papers. Jennifer cried a lot, saying they wanted to take her son away. One day she left the house with a suitcase and never came back." Mrs. Henderson's information left Margaret even more intrigued. If Michael was a normal child who sang and spoke normally, what could have happened to make him stop communicating completely? That night, Margaret decided to stay later at the mansion to observe the household routine. She hid in the kitchen pantry and waited. Around 10 o'clock, she heard footsteps coming down the stairs again. It was Michael wearing light blue pajamas, walking barefoot through the dark house. Margaret followed him at a safe distance and saw when the boy entered the living room, went to the grand piano in the corner and sat on the bench. What happened next brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Michael began to play a beautiful and melancholic melody, his small fingers sliding across the keys with impressive skill. And then, softly, almost whispering, he began to sing. The voice was truly angelic, sweet and in tune, exactly as Mrs. Henderson had described. Michael sang a sad song about longing and separation, and Margaret realized that every word was filled with pain and emotion. "He can speak," she murmured, moved. "He can sing. Why is he pretending he can't?" The mystery deepened with each discovery. Margaret began paying attention to all the details of the house, looking for clues that would explain Michael's strange behavior and Richard's coldness. It was on a Friday afternoon that she found the first real clue. While cleaning Richard's office, Margaret found a slightly open drawer with several papers. Among them was a contract with a famous record label from New York. The document spoke of an exclusive child artist and mentioned profit percentages, contractual obligations, and exclusivity clauses. The name on the contract was Michael Thompson, child vocalist. "My God," whispered Margaret, flipping through the contract. He turned his own son into a money-making machine. The clauses were absurd for a child. Weekly performances, mandatory recordings, prohibition from studying music with other teachers, and even more shocking, a clause that prevented Michael from singing anywhere not related to the contract. Margaret discreetly photographed the most important pages with her cell phone and put the papers back exactly where she had found them. Her mind was buzzing with possibilities of what could have happened. If Michael had a contract as a child singer, why had he stopped singing? And why was his father lying, saying he had neurological problems? The answer began to take shape when Margaret found a folder hidden behind the books on the shelf. Inside were letters, many letters, all addressed to Michael and signed by Mommy. The letters were heartbreaking. Jennifer Thompson begged to see her son, said she missed him every day, and promised that one day they would be together again. In one of the most recent letters, dated just 2 months ago, she wrote, "My dear Michael, Mommy hasn't given up on you. I know your father has said bad things about me, but none of it is true. I am fighting in court to take you with me. You don't have to sing anymore if you don't want to. You can just be a normal child, play, go to school, have friends. I love you more than anything in this world." Margaret had to hold back her tears. The situation was becoming clearer. Michael had been forced to sing professionally from a very young age. His parents had probably separated because of it, and now the boy was being kept silent by his own father. But why would Richard do this? What was the reason for keeping Michael quiet and away from his mother? The answer came from an unexpected source. The following Monday, while Margaret was preparing breakfast, the doorbell rang. It was an elegant woman about 70 years old, with well-groomed white hair and expensive clothes. "Good morning, I am Elizabeth Thompson, Richard's mother," said the lady with authority. "I need to speak with my grandson." Margaret was confused. Richard had never mentioned that Michael's grandmother visited the house. "Mr. Richard is not home, Mrs. Elizabeth. He left early for work." "I didn't come to speak with my son. I came to speak with Michael," insisted the lady. "It's been months since I've seen my grandson. Richard always makes an excuse when I call." Margaret hesitated. She didn't know if she should let the woman in without Richard's permission, but something in Mrs. Elizabeth's determined expression convinced her. "Please, come in. Michael should be in his room." Mrs. Elizabeth went up the stairs with firm steps and knocked on Michael's door. Margaret followed her, curious to see the boy's reaction upon seeing his grandmother. When the door opened, Michael stood still for a few seconds, processing his grandmother's presence. His eyes filled with tears, and he threw himself into her arms, hugging her tightly. "My dear grandson," said Mrs. Elizabeth, stroking the boy's hair, "why are you so thin? And why aren't you talking to Grandma?" Michael looked at Margaret and then at his grandmother, as if he wanted to speak but couldn't. Margaret realized it was time to intervene. "Mrs. Elizabeth, may I speak with you privately?" The two women went down to the living room, leaving Michael in the bedroom. Margaret took a deep breath before starting to recount everything she had discovered: the drawings, the nightly singing, the record contract, the letters from his mother. Mrs. Elizabeth listened with an expression of growing shock. "I knew something was wrong," she said, running her trembling hands over her face. "Richard was always too ambitious, but I never imagined he would do this to his own son." "Did you know about Michael's singing career?" "I did, and I was against it from the start. A 5-year-old child shouldn't be in recording studios, performing shows, and being treated like an adult." But Richard was blinded by the money Michael generated. "And what about his parents' separation?" Mrs. Elizabeth sighed deeply. "Jennifer tried to protect Michael. She wanted him to stop singing professionally and live a normal childhood. Richard wouldn't accept it and managed to get sole custody in court, claiming Jennifer was harming their son's career." The puzzle pieces were starting to come together in Margaret's mind. Michael had stopped speaking as a form of silent protest against his father. If he couldn't sing for his mother, he wouldn't sing for anyone. "Mrs. Elizabeth, why is Richard lying about neurological problems?" "Probably to justify Michael's silence and prevent anyone from discovering the truth. If people found out he forced a child to sing against his will until he lost his voice by choice, it would be a scandal." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing, Margaret and Mrs. Elizabeth devised a plan. They needed concrete evidence of what Richard was doing and a way to reunite Michael with his mother. But they had to be careful, as Richard was a powerful man with good lawyers. "Margaret, can you continue caring for Michael for a few more days? I need time to speak with some lawyers and get in touch with Jennifer." "Of course, Mrs. Elizabeth. I'll do anything to help that boy." In the following days, Margaret developed a special routine with Michael. She began leaving paper and pencils in the kitchen every day, and Michael would respond by drawing increasingly elaborate recipes. It was his way of communicating, and Margaret discovered she could talk with him through food. When she left out cake ingredients, Michael would draw sweet recipes. When there were vegetables, he would create colorful salads. It was as if he were telling stories through cooking. One morning, Margaret left a photo of her own family on the counter: herself, her husband, and their 2 grown children, all smiling at a birthday party. Michael saw the photo and spent a long time looking at it. The next day, he had drawn a birthday cake recipe with colorful candles, but in the drawing there were only 2 figures, an adult woman and a boy. It was obvious Michael was drawing himself with his mother. "You miss your mother, don't you?" whispered Margaret when Michael came to get ingredients from the kitchen. The boy stopped, looked into her eyes, and nodded. "Yes." It was the first time he had directly responded to a question. "She misses you too, my angel. Very much." Michael approached Margaret, and for the first time since she had arrived at the house, he hugged her. It was a desperate hug, from someone who needed to feel affection and protection. Margaret returned the hug, feeling the boy's thin, fragile little body against hers. At that moment, she made a decision. She would do everything in her power to help Michael find happiness again. The following week, Mrs. Elizabeth returned with news. She had managed to contact Jennifer and discovered important information about the separation process. Jennifer is staying with her sister in Philadelphia, Mrs. Elizabeth told Margaret, while Michael played in the garden. She never stopped fighting for custody of her son. The case is in court, but Richard has good lawyers and a lot of money. And what about the Singer contract? I found out something terrible. Michael signed that contract when he was only 5 years old. It's illegal and can be voided, but Richard is hiding this from everyone. That's why he made up the story about neurological problems. Exactly. If anyone finds out that Michael is normal and was forced to sing professionally when he was very young, Richard could lose custody and even face legal problems. Margaret felt anger growing inside her. How could a father be capable of using his own son in this way? Mrs. Elizabeth, we need to do something. Michael is suffering too much. I'm already taking care of it. I hired a lawyer who specializes in children's rights. She will study the case and see what we can do. But things got complicated sooner than expected. The following Thursday, Richard came home early and found Margaret talking with Michael in the kitchen. The boy was showing her a drawing of a family gathered around a table full of food. "What's going on here?" asked Richard in a threatening voice. "Just preparing dinner, Mr. Richard," replied Margaret, trying to stay calm. "Why is Michael in the kitchen? He should be in his room." "He came down to get some water. It's no problem." Richard approached Michael and spoke in a harsh tone. "Go up to your room now." Michael obeyed immediately, but before leaving the kitchen, he looked at Margaret with an expression of sadness that broke her heart. When they were alone, Richard turned to Margaret with eyes full of anger. "Listen carefully, Margaret. You're here to cook, not to play psychologist with my son. Michael has serious problems and doesn't need unnecessary stimulation. But Mr. Richard, he seems to understand everything perfectly. Maybe nothing," shouted Richard. "You know nothing about his condition. If you keep interfering, you'll have to look for another job." Margaret swallowed hard. She needed this job, but more than that, she needed to stay there to protect Michael. She decided to back down temporarily. "I'm sorry, Mr. Richard, it won't happen again." "It better not." That night, Margaret called Mrs. Elizabeth and told her about the incident. "He's getting nervous because he knows we're discovering the truth," said Mrs. Elizabeth. "We need to speed up the process before he does something drastic." "What kind of drastic thing?" "I don't know, but I know my son. When Richard feels cornered, he's capable of anything to protect his own interests." Mrs. Elizabeth's words proved prophetic. The following Friday, Margaret arrived at the mansion and found several men in suits carrying boxes out of the house. "What's happening?" she asked one of the men. "Moving. The boss ordered everything packed today." Margaret ran inside the house and found Richard supervising the packing process. "Mr. Richard, are you moving?" "I received an irresistible job offer in Washington, D.C., lied Richard. "We're leaving later today." "And Michael? Is he all right?" "Michael will be much better away from here. New environment, new doctors, new treatment possibilities." Margaret immediately realized this was an escape. Richard had found out that Mrs. Elizabeth was investigating the case and decided to disappear with Michael before the truth came out. "Can I say goodbye to him?" "That's not necessary. Michael doesn't form attachments to people. It's better this way." Margaret pretended to accept the explanation, but inside she was desperate. She needed to warn Mrs. Elizabeth immediately, and perhaps it was still possible to stop the move. She left the mansion and called Mrs. Elizabeth from the payphone on the corner. "Mrs. Elizabeth, they are leaving today. Richard said he got a job in Washington, D.C., but I am sure it's a lie." "My God. I will call the lawyer right now. Maybe there's still time to get a court order to stop the trip." "What if there isn't enough time?" "Then we will have to find another way to help Michael." Margaret returned to the mansion determined to do something. She couldn't just stand by and watch Michael be taken away from his mother and from any possibility of help. She found an open window on the second floor and risked climbing up the back service stairs. She needed to speak with Michael one last time, even if it was just to say she wouldn't abandon him. The boy's room was almost empty, with only a small suitcase on the bed. Michael was sitting on the floor, hugging an old worn-out teddy bear. "Michael," whispered Margaret from the doorway, "may I come in?" The boy looked up with eyes red from crying and nodded yes. Margaret knelt beside him and held his small hands. "Listen carefully, my angel. I know you can understand me perfectly. Your grandmother and I are trying to help you, but your father is taking you away before we could." Michael looked at her with his full attention. "I want you to know that your mother loves you very much and never stopped fighting to be with you. She didn't abandon you like your father may have said." Tears rolled down Michael's eyes. "And I want you to know that you are brave for keeping your silence. I know you are trying to protect yourself, but perhaps a time will come when you need to speak to be saved. When that time comes, don't be afraid." Michael let go of one of Margaret's hands and pointed to his own chest. "Are you scared?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes. It's normal to be scared, my love. But always remember, you are stronger than you think, and there are people who love you and want to protect you." Michael threw himself into Margaret's arms once more. She held him tight, trying to convey all the love and encouragement he would need to face the difficult days ahead. "Margaret!" shouted Richard from downstairs. "Where are you?" "I have to go," she whispered to Michael, "but I promise I won't give up on you." Margaret quickly went downstairs and found Richard furious in the living room. "What were you doing up there?" "Just checking if I had forgotten anything while cleaning the rooms," she lied. "Well, you can leave. Your services are no longer needed." "But Mr. Richard, There will be no more discussion. Get your things and go." Margaret picked up her purse and left the mansion heartbroken. On the sidewalk, she saw Michael at his bedroom window, looking at her with an expression of despair. She discreetly waved to him and mouthed the words without sound. "I'll be back." 2 hours later, Mrs. Elizabeth called Margaret with bad news. The lawyer got the court order, but they had already left. Richard used a private jet and didn't leave a destination address. "And now how will we find Michael? We will have to be patient and smart. My son may have money and influence, but he has made many mistakes. We will use that against him." Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video and especially to subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The next 3 months were the most distressing of Margaret's life. She couldn't stop thinking about Michael, wondering if he was okay, if he was still silent, if he missed home. Mrs. Elizabeth kept Margaret informed about the progress of the investigations. The child rights attorney, Dr. Sarah Wilson, had discovered several irregularities in the contract Michael had signed with the record label. "The contract is completely illegal," explained Dr. Sarah in a meeting with Margaret and Mrs. Elizabeth. "A 5-year-old child cannot sign any type of work contract in the United States. Furthermore, the exclusivity and mandatory performance clauses constitute child labor." "Can this help Jennifer gain custody of Michael?" "Absolutely. But first we need to find them. Richard is being very clever about hiding their whereabouts." The lead they needed came from an unexpected source. Margaret was grocery shopping when she recognized a woman in the checkout line. It was Nancy, the housekeeper who worked at the mansion before she arrived. "Nancy," Margaret called out, approaching her. "Hi, Margaret. How are you? I heard Mr. Richard moved. Did you go with him?" "No. He fired me on moving day. By the way, do you know where they went?" Nancy looked around cautiously. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but I felt sorry for the boy. They're at a farm in Vermont near Woodstock. A friend of Mr. Richard's loaned him the property." "Do you have the address?" "Not exactly, but I know it's on the road to Saratoga Springs. A large farm with a black iron gate and a chapel on the grounds." Margaret thanked her for the information and ran to call Mrs. Elizabeth. They finally had a concrete lead on Michael's whereabouts. "I'll notify the attorney immediately," said Mrs. Elizabeth. "With this information, she can get a search and seizure order." "How long will that take?" "A few days, maybe a week, but it's our best chance to bring Michael back." Margaret couldn't wait another week. With each passing day, Michael was further from the people who wanted to help him. She made a risky decision. She would go to the farm on her own to check on the boy. The following Saturday, Margaret took a bus to Woodstock and then a taxi to the rural area Nancy had described. It wasn't hard to find the farm. It was exactly as the former housekeeper had said, with black iron gates and a small chapel in the middle of the property. Margaret asked the taxi driver to wait on the road and approached the farm's entrance. There was an intercom, but she decided to try a more direct approach. She walked along the wall until she found a lower section where she could jump inside the property. Her heart was pounding as she hid behind trees and bushes, trying to get closer to the main house. The house was large and rustic, typical of old farms, with a wide porch and a well-kept garden. Margaret saw movement in one of the windows and immediately recognized Michael's silhouette. The boy was in the living room, sitting alone on a sofa, flipping through a book. He looked thinner than before and had an even sadder expression on his face. Margaret waited until she was sure Richard wasn't nearby and then approached the window. She tapped lightly on the glass to get Michael's attention. When the boy saw her, his eyes widened with surprise and joy. He ran to the window and tried to open it, but it was locked. Margaret used gestures to ask if he was okay. Michael nodded yes, but pointed to his own chest and shook his head no, indicating he wasn't happy. "Where is your father?" Margaret mouthed silently. Michael pointed toward the back of the house and then held up 5 fingers, indicating that Richard would be back in 5 minutes. "I'm going to get you out of here," Margaret promised, still in silence. "Your grandmother and your mother are fighting for you." Michael put his hand on the window, and Margaret did the same from the outside, as if they were touching through the glass. "Just be strong a little longer," she pleaded. At that moment, they heard the sound of a car approaching. Michael made desperate gestures for Margaret to hide. She ran behind a large tree and saw Richard getting out of a black car carrying shopping bags. Margaret waited for him to enter the house and then cautiously returned to the taxi, waiting for her on the road. "Did you find what you were looking for?" asked the driver. "I did," she replied, wiping the tears she couldn't control. Back in New York, Margaret reported everything she had seen to Mrs. Elizabeth and Dr. Sarah. "You were very brave, but also very reckless," scolded the lawyer. "If Richard had seen you, he could have disappeared again. But at least we know Michael is physically well," Margaret defended herself. "And that is important," agreed Mrs. Elizabeth. "Now we are sure of the exact place where they are." Dr. Sarah had managed to contact Jennifer, and the 4 women met to plan the rescue strategy for Michael. Jennifer was a young-looking woman with short brown hair and blue eyes just like her son's. She was visibly worn down by the months of separation, but determined to fight. "I knew Richard was ambitious, but I never imagined he would go this far," said Jennifer, her voice choked. "Michael was such a happy child. He sang all the time, made up songs for everything." "And he stopped singing when you separated?" asked Margaret. "Not immediately. In the first few weeks, he still tried to call me secretly from his father to sing the songs he composed. But then he just stopped. Richard said he was traumatized by the separation and that it was better for me to stay away completely." "Did you believe that?" "At first, yes. I thought it really would be better for Michael if I stayed away until he adjusted. But when months passed and Richard didn't even allow phone calls, I began to suspect something was wrong." Dr. Sarah had already obtained the court order to retrieve Michael from the farm. The operation was scheduled for the following Monday, with the support of social workers and a child psychologist. "Jennifer, you need to be prepared," warned the lawyer. "Michael may be very changed psychologically. 3 years is a long time in a child's life." "I know. I just want him to know that I never stopped loving him and fighting for him." Margaret offered to accompany the operation, since Michael trusted her and her presence could help calm him during the process. On Monday, the group arrived at the farm in 2 cars, one with Dr. Sarah, Jennifer, and Margaret, the other with the social workers and the psychologist. Mrs. Elizabeth had stayed in New York, but had called Margaret to wish her good luck. When they rang the farm's doorbell, Richard took several minutes to answer. When he finally appeared, he was visibly nervous and tried to block the group's entry. "You can't come in here without a warrant," he protested. "We have a court order," said Dr. Sarah, showing the papers. A search and welfare check order for a minor. Richard had no choice but to allow them in. The group went straight to the room where Margaret had seen Michael through the window a few days earlier. The boy was there, but this time he wasn't alone. Sitting beside him was a woman who introduced herself as Michael's private tutor. He's being homeschooled because he has socialization difficulties, Richard explained quickly. Michael looked at the group in surprise, and when he saw Margaret, his eyes lit up. But when he noticed Jennifer's presence, his reaction was even more intense. He turned pale and began to tremble. "Michael," called Jennifer softly, approaching slowly. "It's me, my love. Mommy." To everyone's shock, Michael backed away and hid behind the sofa, as if he were afraid of his own mother. "You see," said Richard, with a triumphant tone. "He doesn't even recognize his mother anymore. You're traumatizing my son with this invasion." The psychologist, Dr. James Miller, calmly approached Michael. "Hi, Michael, I'm James. I came here to talk with you. You don't need to be afraid." Michael looked at the psychologist and then at Margaret, as if seeking guidance about what to do. "It's all right, my angel," said Margaret softly. "These people came here to help you." For the first time in months, Michael made a sound, a whisper too low to be understood. "What did you say, Michael?" asked Dr. James, kneeling down to the boy's level. Michael looked around, saw his father watching intently, and fell silent again. Margaret realized what was happening. Michael wanted to speak, but was afraid to do so in front of Richard. "Mr. Richard," she said, "would it be possible for you to give us a few minutes to speak with Michael in private?" "Absolutely not. I won't leave my son alone with strangers." "I'm not a stranger," said Jennifer with a firm voice. "I'm his mother." "You lost the right to call yourself a mother when you abandoned your son." "I didn't abandon him. You took him away from me." The argument was becoming tense, and Michael began to show signs of anxiety. Dr. James intervened. "Let's all calm down. Michael needs a peaceful environment to express himself." It was then that something unexpected happened. Michael stood up, walked over to where Margaret was, and tugged on the hem of her blouse. When she bent down, he whispered something in her ear. "What did he say?" asked Dr. James. Margaret looked at Michael, who nodded his head, encouraging her to repeat it. "He said, 'I want to go home.'" "This is his home now," said Richard quickly. Michael shook his head no and pointed at Jennifer. "He wants to go home with his mother?" asked Dr. James. Michael nodded yes. "Michael, can you talk to me?" asked Jennifer, slowly approaching. The boy looked at his father, who was staring at him with a threatening expression. Then he looked at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. I can," whispered Michael so quietly it was almost inaudible. "My God," murmured Jennifer with tears in her eyes. "You can talk." "Of course he can," said Richard with desperation in his voice. "I told you he has intermittent problems. Sometimes he talks, sometimes he doesn't." But Michael was no longer listening to his father. For the first time in 3 years, he ran toward his mother and threw himself into her arms. "Mommy," he said, with a clear and emotional voice. "I missed you so much." Jennifer hugged her son, as if she wanted to make up for all the lost hugs of the past years. "I missed you too, my love, every single day. Daddy said you didn't want anything to do with me anymore. That was never true, Michael. I fought every day to get back to you." Dr. James watched the interaction between mother and son with professional attention. "Michael, can you tell me why you stopped talking?" The boy looked at his father one more time before answering. "Because Daddy said that if I talked about the bad things he made me do, Mommy could have trouble with the law." "What kind of bad things?" asked Dr. James gently. "Singing when I didn't want to, spending hours in the studio, not being able to play with other kids because it could ruin my voice, taking sleeping pills when I cried for Mommy." Michael's revelations fell like bombs in the room. Richard tried to protest, but Dr. Sarah was already writing down everything the boy said. "Michael, do you still like to sing?" asked Margaret. "I do, but only when I want to, not because someone forces me." "Would you like to sing something now?" Michael looked at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. "Can I sing the song I made for you, Mommy?" "Of course, my love." Michael took a deep breath and began to sing a simple but beautiful melody, with lyrics about longing and hope. His voice was more mature than 3 years ago, but still kept the angelic sweetness that Margaret had heard that night at the mansion. Everyone in the room was moved by the performance. It was impossible to deny that Michael was a normal, healthy, and talented child who had been deprived of freedom of expression by his own father. "I think we've heard enough," said Dr. Sarah. "Michael, would you like to go home with your mother today?" "Can I?" he asked, looking at Jennifer with hope. "If you want to, yes." "And can Margaret come along? She took care of me and made delicious food." Everyone looked at Margaret, who was trying to control her emotions. "If your mother agrees, I would be very happy to keep taking care of you. Please, Mommy. Margaret is really nice and she understands my food drawings." Jennifer smiled through her tears. "Of course, my love. Margaret will always be welcome in our home." The rescue operation had been a complete success. Michael was free to return to his mother, and all the irregularities committed by Richard would be investigated by the courts. In the car on the way back to New York, Michael wouldn't stop talking. It was as if 3 years of forced silence needed to be made up for in a few hours. He talked about the drawings he made, the songs he composed in his head, the books he read hidden from his father. "Margaret," he said during the trip, "you knew I could talk from the beginning, didn't you?" "I suspected, my angel. You're too smart to have neurological problems. Daddy said that if I spoke, he would make Mommy disappear forever." "Your father can't threaten anyone anymore," Jennifer assured him. "Now it's just the 3 of us, you, me, and Margaret." "And Grandma Elizabeth?" "Your grandmother too. She helped a lot to find us." Michael smiled for the first time in a long while. "I want to make a thank you song for all the people who helped me." "What a beautiful idea," said Margaret. "And I can make a special cake for the presentation of your song. With colorful frosting? With everything you want, my love." 6 months later, Michael was unrecognizable. He had gained weight, was taller, and most importantly, had completely regained his joy for life. He attended a regular school, had friends his own age, and sang only when he wanted, for pleasure. Margaret continued working for the family, but now her role went far beyond cooking. She had become a second mother to Michael, someone who understood and supported him at all times. The courts had been strict with Richard. He lost custody permanently, was forced to pay compensation for emotional damages to Michael and Jennifer, and still faced charges for child labor and exploitation of a minor. Mrs. Elizabeth visited her grandson regularly and constantly apologized for not realizing sooner what her son was doing. "Don't blame yourself, Mrs. Elizabeth," Margaret always said. "What matters is that Michael is well now." One Sunday afternoon, while they were preparing a special lunch together, Michael asked a question that moved Margaret. "Margaret, do you think God puts the right people in our lives just when we need them most?" "Why do you ask that, my angel?" "Because when I needed someone who understood me the most, you showed up, and when I needed to go back to Mommy the most, you helped me." Margaret stopped stirring the sauce she was preparing and hugged Michael. "I think so, my love. And you know what? You also showed up in my life when I needed it most. You taught me that being a cook isn't just about making food, it's about taking care of the people we love." "I love you very much, Margaret." "I love you too, Michael. Very, very much." That evening, Michael presented to the gathered family the song he had composed about his entire journey. It was a song about silence and voice, about fear and courage, about separation and reunion. As she listened to the boy's sweet and in-tune voice, Margaret thought about how mysterious life can be. She had entered that mansion expecting only to cook for a family, but ended up saving a child and gaining a son in her heart. Michael was not disabled. He never had been. He was just a sensitive boy who had found in silence a way to protect himself and the mother he loved so much. And when he finally felt safe enough to speak again, his voice brought not only words, but also music, joy, and hope to everyone around him. The cook had discovered much more than the reason for the boy's silence. She had discovered the transformative power of a mother's love, of female courage, and of the determination to protect the most vulnerable. End of story. And you, dear listener, what did you think of the journey of Michael, Margaret, and Jennifer? Do you believe Margaret made the right decisions by risking everything to save a boy she barely knew? Leave your opinion in the comments and tell us where you are following us from. If this story touched your heart as much as it touched ours, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories we have prepared, especially for you.